In the dimly lit hotel room of the New York Hilton, Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping stared in disbelief at the television set before him. It was January 1979, and the architect of China's future reforms had just pressed a button on the remote control, revealing yet another channel, the 15th he had counted in the last few minutes. Back in Beijing, the entirety of China had access to a single, state-controlled channel that broadcast for only a few hours each day. Here, in the heart of Manhattan, a bewildering array of programming flowed ceaselessly through the small box. News anchors delivering reports from across the globe, entertainment shows featuring laughing audiences, advertisements for products he had never imagined, and channels dedicated solely to sports, movies, or music. For a man raised in the austere information environment of Communist China, this technological cornucopia represented more than just entertainment. It was a glimpse into an entirely different relationship between state, media, and citizen. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The encounter between Chinese officials and American television in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s represents one of the most profound yet understudied cultural shocks of the Cold War era. It marked a pivotal moment when two radically different information ecosystems collided, creating ripples that would ultimately contribute to China's own media transformation. What the Chinese delegation witnessed was not merely a technological marvel, but a fundamentally different conception of what television could be. Not just a tool for state communication, but a vast, pluralistic landscape of content driven by market forces, viewer preferences, and a constitutional commitment to free expression. The year was 1979, and China was just beginning to emerge from decades of self-imposed isolation. The Cultural Revolution had ended just 3 years earlier with Mao Zedong's death in 1976. For nearly 3 decades, China's 800 million citizens had lived in an environment where information was tightly controlled, with radio and television serving primarily as vehicles for political education and party propaganda. The concept of television as entertainment, let alone as a commercial enterprise with hundreds of viewing options, was simply alien to Chinese experience. Chinese television had begun modestly in 1958 with Beijing Television Station, later renamed China Central Television, or CCTV. Broadcasting initially occurred only for a few hours each evening, primarily featuring news, revolutionary performances, and educational programs. By the late 1970s, despite some expansion, most Chinese citizens with access to television, and they were few, could watch only a single channel. Programming began around 6 p.m. and concluded by 10 p.m., featuring a rigid schedule of news, political documentaries, and occasional entertainment under strict ideological supervision. Contrast this with the United States, where by the late 1970s, the television landscape was already diverse and rapidly expanding. The 3 major networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, had dominated for decades, but technological changes were underway that would revolutionize American viewing habits. Cable television, which had initially emerged in the 1950s as a solution for communities with poor broadcast reception, was transforming into a content revolution. The launch of home box office, HBO, in 1972 had demonstrated the viability of premium cable channels, while Ted Turner's transformation of his local Atlanta station into a superstation distributed nationally via satellite in 1976 signaled the dawn of a new era. When the first major Chinese delegations arrived in the United States, following the normalization of relations, they encountered a television ecosystem on the cusp of explosive growth. The contrast could not have been more stark. From one channel to dozens, from state control to market competition, from ideological uniformity to pluralistic content, from limited broadcasting hours to 24/7 programming. Zheng Hanzi, a diplomat and English translator who accompanied Chinese officials on early visits to the United States, later recalled, "Many of our delegation members would return to their hotel rooms after official meetings and spend hours simply changing channels on the television. They were fascinated not just by the quantity of channels, but by the diversity of content and perspectives. Some would stay up until dawn, watching, trying to comprehend this phenomenon. For these officials, many of whom had spent their careers in an environment where information was carefully controlled and curated, the American television experience was both fascinating and disorienting." Li Jisui, Mao's former personal physician who later moved to the United States, described how one senior Chinese official was perplexed by the coexistence of news programs that seemed to criticize the American government alongside entertainment shows that appeared to celebrate American life. How can a government allow media to criticize its leaders so openly and still maintain order? The official reportedly asked. This question, how a society could function with such an open information environment, would become central to China's own evolving relationship with television and mass media in the coming decades. It represented a fundamentally different understanding of media's role in society, as a mirror reflecting diverse realities rather than a tool projecting a single ideological vision. The contrast became even more pronounced in the early 1980s as the American cable television industry exploded. The launch of CNN in 1980 as the first 24-hour news network, followed by MTV in 1981, represented new types of content specialization that were completely foreign to the Chinese conception of television. By 1982, approximately 23% of American households subscribed to cable services, with many having access to 30 or more channels. Premium channels like HBO and Showtime offered uncensored movies, while specialized networks began catering to specific interests from sports to cooking to children's programming. The Chinese officials who visited during this period were witnessing not just a different media system, but a different philosophical approach to information itself. In America, television was increasingly viewed as a consumer product tailored to viewer preferences and market demands. In China, it remained primarily a state instrument for education and ideological guidance. Wang Zhongwen, who served in the Chinese embassy in Washington during the early 1980s, described in his memoirs the confusion among visiting officials. They would ask me how the American government allowed such freedom in broadcasting, even criticism of their own policies. I explained that in America, television was not seen primarily as a government tool, but as private enterprise and protected expression. This concept was difficult for many to grasp fully. The disparity extended beyond content to the very economics of television. Visiting Chinese media officials were astounded by the commercial nature of American broadcasting, the constant advertisements, the competition for ratings, the massive production budgets. Liu Zhongde, who would later serve as China's Minister of Culture, remarked after a 1983 visit to several American television studios, "Their entire system operates on different principles. Programs exist to attract viewers for advertisers, not primarily to educate or inform citizens according to state priorities. It is an entirely different relationship between media and audience." This commercial model was particularly foreign to Chinese officials who had operated in a system where television was funded entirely by the state and viewed primarily as a public service and propaganda tool. The concept of television as a profit-driven enterprise responding to market forces rather than centralized planning represented a fundamentally different approach. The technological aspects of American television production also created significant impressions. Delegation members who visited network studios in New York and Los Angeles returned with reports of advanced equipment, sophisticated production techniques, and massive infrastructural investments that dwarfed China's television capabilities. Many advocated for technological upgrades to China's broadcasting infrastructure, arguing that technical modernization was necessary regardless of content considerations. Li Deliang, an engineer with Chinese Central Television who visited NBC's studios in 1984, wrote in his official report, "The technological gap between our television capabilities and the Americans is at least 15 years. Their smallest local stations have equipment superior to our national broadcaster. Without significant investment in our technical infrastructure, we cannot hope to develop television as a modern mass medium, regardless of content considerations." This emphasis on technological development would become an important aspect of China's television evolution in the 1980s and beyond. Even as content remained under tight control, Chinese authorities proved willing to invest in technical modernization, creating a curious hybrid of advanced broadcasting technology delivering carefully controlled content. Perhaps the most profound impression on Chinese officials came from witnessing television's central role in American daily life. They observed how television had become integrated into American homes, families, and social routines, how it shaped conversation, consumer behavior, and cultural understanding. In hotel rooms, officials would watch American families on sitcoms gathered around their television sets, a mirror of the very activity they themselves were engaged in. Zhao Shizheng, who would later become the head of China's State Council Information Office, noted after a 1985 visit, "American television is not just a technology or even a medium. It has become a central social institution that connects citizens to their culture, their politics, and each other. It serves functions far beyond what we have traditionally expected from our broadcasting system." This observation, that television could be a social binding agent rather than simply a top-down communication tool, would significantly influence China's own television development in subsequent years. The idea that television might serve as a shared cultural experience that could unify a diverse population had obvious appeal to Chinese authorities, seeking to maintain national cohesion during a period of rapid economic and social change. As the 1980s progressed, the gap between Chinese and American television experiences only widened. The Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984 deregulated cable television in the United States, accelerating industry growth and channel proliferation. By 1985, some American cable systems offered 50 or more channels, while specialized networks continued to multiply. The Discovery Channel launched in 1985, followed by the Fox Broadcasting Company in 1986. Meanwhile, Chinese television was also evolving, though at a different pace and with different priorities. China Central Television, CCTV, had launched its second channel in 1986, and various provincial television stations were established or expanded. Advertising was introduced in limited form in the early 1980s, bringing a partial commercial element to the previously state-funded system. Limited foreign programming, primarily sports, nature documentaries, and carefully selected entertainment, began appearing on Chinese screens. The introduction of television advertising in China represented a significant acknowledgment of principles observed in the American system. Zhang Yimou, who worked in China's television sector during this period before becoming an internationally acclaimed film director, later observed, "The introduction of advertising was our first step toward recognizing that television needed to consider audience preferences and commercial viability, not just political messaging." It was a small opening to market principles, though content remained under strict supervision. This limited commercialization created an interesting hybrid. Programs still required political approval, but producers now also needed to consider viewer appeal to attract advertisers. This dual accountability to both state authorities and audience preferences would become a defining characteristic of Chinese television development in the coming decades. For Chinese officials, these incremental changes represented a cautious adaptation rather than wholesale adoption of the American model. They sought to incorporate certain aspects of commercial television, particularly its technical sophistication and entertainment value, while maintaining fundamental control over content and messaging. As Jiang Zemin, who would later become China's president, reportedly remarked in an internal meeting in 1987, "We can learn from the American television industry's technical expertise and production quality without adopting their uncontrolled content model." This selective approach reflected a broader pattern in China's opening to the outside world during this period: technological and economic modernization without corresponding political liberalization. Television became a microcosm of this strategy, adopting modern production techniques, limited commercialization, and certain entertainment formats while maintaining strict content controls and ideological boundaries. By the mid-1980s, Chinese delegations visiting the United States included more specialized media professionals seeking specific insights into American television operations. These visits became more technical and focused, examining production methods, broadcasting technology, programming strategies, and audience research. Reports from these delegations increasingly emphasized practical applications rather than philosophical differences. Wang Jianzhou, who participated in a 1986 media delegation to the United States and would later become a senior television executive in China, recalled, "Our earlier visits were dominated by shock at the fundamental differences between the systems. By the mid-1980s, we were asking more nuanced questions about specific aspects of television production and management that might be adapted to our conditions while maintaining our distinct approach to media's role in society." This evolution reflected growing Chinese confidence in charting its own media development path, one that would incorporate selected aspects of international practice while maintaining distinct Chinese characteristics. The initial shock had given way to a more strategic assessment of what elements might be selectively borrowed. Meanwhile, American television continued its rapid expansion. By 1987, cable reached approximately 50% of American households, with many systems offering 60 or more channels. The launch of Fox as a fourth major network in 1986 had further diversified the broadcast landscape, while cable networks continued to multiply and specialize. This ongoing proliferation heightened the contrast with China's still limited television options. Despite expansion to 2 national channels and various provincial broadcasters, Chinese television remained tightly controlled in both quantity and content. The gap between the two systems had grown even wider since those first delegations expressed amazement at 15-channel hotel television systems in 1979. For ordinary Chinese citizens, glimpses of this alternative television universe came primarily through limited official imports, stories from returning visitors, and occasional viewing in luxury hotels catering to foreigners, which were permitted to receive foreign satellite broadcasts. These restricted exposures created a mystique around foreign television that would contribute to the popularity of smuggled videotapes and later satellite dishes in China. Lu King, a journalist who covered both Chinese and American media during this period, described the fascination. There developed among certain Chinese a romantic notion of American television as a wonderland of entertainment and information freedom. The reality was more complex, with American television having its own commercial constraints and quality issues. But the contrast with China's limited options created an idealized image among those who had only glimpsed it. This perception gap between limited official exposure and idealized imagination would become an important factor in China's media development, creating domestic pressure for expanded entertainment options even as authorities sought to maintain content control. By the late 1980s, this tension between growing awareness of international media alternatives and continued domestic content restrictions was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The introduction of consumer video cassette recorders in China had already created an alternative channel for foreign content through underground distribution networks for imported tapes. Satellite dishes, though technically restricted, began appearing in southern China to receive Hong Kong television broadcasts. These technological end runs around official broadcasting restrictions demonstrated that the controlled information environment of earlier decades was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in an era of globalization and advancing technology. The television genie, once glimpsed by officials in American hotel rooms, was proving difficult to keep bottled within China's borders. The events of 1989, culminating in the Tiananmen Square protests and subsequent crackdown, temporarily halted China's media liberalization. Television coverage of these events, particularly international coverage that differed dramatically from domestic reporting, highlighted the political stakes of media control in stark terms. In the aftermath, Chinese authorities reasserted tight control over information channels, including television. Yet even this retrenchment could not entirely reverse the trajectory of change. By the early 1990s, Chinese television would resume its evolution, incorporating more entertainment programming, expanded advertising, and greater production sophistication, all while maintaining firm political boundaries around acceptable content. The seeds planted during those transformative encounters with American television in the late 1970s and 1980s would continue to influence China's media development, albeit in distinctly Chinese ways. As a delegation of Chinese media officials departed New York in December 1988 after studying American television operations, their leader offered a reflection that captured both the impact of their exposure and China's emerging response. "We have seen the future of television's technological possibilities," he told his American hosts at a farewell dinner. "We will take what lessons we can from your experience while following our own path. Television in China will become more diverse and technically advanced, but it will always reflect Chinese priorities and values. Your hundreds of channels have shown us possibilities we had not imagined, but we will determine which possibilities suit China's conditions." This statement encapsulated the complex legacy of these cross-cultural media encounters: genuine admiration for technical achievements, selective adaptation of certain practices, and firm commitment to maintaining a distinctly Chinese approach to television's role in society. The hundreds of American channels had indeed shocked Chinese officials, but that shock had evolved into a more nuanced response that would shape China's own television development for decades to come. As China entered the 1990s, its television landscape stood at a crossroads. The limited system of the 1970s had already evolved significantly, with multiple channels, increased broadcasting hours, more entertainment content, and the introduction of advertising. Yet it remained fundamentally different from the American model that had so astonished those early delegations. The question facing Chinese authorities was how much further this evolution would go, how to balance the desire for modern, appealing television with continued control over its content and influence. This question would become increasingly pressing as satellite technology, digital broadcasting, and eventually the Internet created new challenges for maintaining information boundaries. The shock of those first encounters with American television's channel abundance had initiated a process of adaptation and response that would continue long after those initial delegations returned home. The early 1990s marked a critical turning point in China's response to the American television model. Having absorbed the initial shock of encountering hundreds of channels in the United States, Chinese authorities began implementing their own vision for television expansion, one that would incorporate aspects of the American commercial model while maintaining distinctly Chinese characteristics. This period saw the rapid growth of China's television infrastructure, with the number of television stations increasing from fewer than 100 in 1989 to over 700 by 1995. This expansion was accompanied by fundamental changes in programming philosophy. While news and current affairs remained under tight political control, entertainment programming experienced significant liberalization. Game shows, dramas, variety programs, and sports broadcasts proliferated, creating a more diverse viewing experience that borrowed formats from international television while adapting them to Chinese cultural contexts. Li Yong, who emerged as one of China's most popular television hosts during this period, later reflected, "We began studying international programming formats intensively, game shows, talk shows, variety programs, and adapting them for Chinese audiences. The goal was to create television that was both entertaining and culturally appropriate, drawing on global trends while maintaining Chinese characteristics." This approach, selectively adopting international formats while maintaining control over content and messaging, reflected the broader strategy that Chinese officials had developed in response to their American television exposure. The goal was to create television that could compete with international programming in production quality and entertainment value while still serving national priorities and cultural values. The introduction of satellite television further transformed China's media landscape in the 1990s. In 1990, AsiaSat-1 became the first privately owned satellite to cover the Asia-Pacific region, soon followed by additional satellites that created new broadcasting possibilities. For Chinese authorities, these technological developments presented both opportunities and challenges, allowing expanded distribution of Chinese programming while also creating potential channels for uncontrolled foreign content. China's response was characteristically balanced, embracing satellite technology for domestic distribution while implementing regulations to limit direct reception of foreign satellite broadcasts by ordinary citizens. In 1993, China launched its first domestic satellite television channel, coordinating programming across multiple provincial stations to create a national network that could compete with international broadcasters in production values and audience appeal. This development directly reflected lessons learned from observing American cable television's growth. As Zhao Huayong, who served as director of CCTV during this period, noted in an internal planning document, "Our satellite channel strategy must learn from international networks like CNN and MTV in production quality and audience engagement while maintaining our own content standards and cultural identity." The impact of these changes on Chinese viewing habits was profound. Television rapidly became the dominant mass medium in China, with average viewing time increasing from less than 1 hour per day in the late 1980s to over 3 hours by the mid-1990s. The number of television sets in China grew from approximately 70 million in 1985 to over 300 million by 1995, reaching nearly every urban household and a growing proportion of rural ones. This transformation created a new relationship between Chinese citizens and television, one that increasingly resembled the central role of television in American households that had so impressed early Chinese visitors. Television viewing became a core family activity and primary leisure pursuit, with popular programs attracting audiences of hundreds of millions and creating shared cultural reference points across China's vast population. Wang Shi, a sociologist who studied Chinese media consumption patterns during this period, observed, "Television became the center of family life in ways remarkably similar to what Chinese officials had observed in America a decade earlier. The difference was that Chinese authorities had managed this transition while maintaining much greater control over content than existed in the American system. This controlled expansion created a distinctive hybrid, a television system with growing diversity and entertainment value operating within political boundaries that remained far more restrictive than those in the United States. It represented neither wholesale adoption of the American model nor simple continuation of the limited state television of earlier decades, but rather a third path tailored to China's specific conditions and priorities. The economic underpinnings of Chinese television also evolved dramatically during this period, moving from pure state funding toward a mixed model incorporating substantial advertising revenue. By 1995, advertising had become the primary funding source for most Chinese television stations, creating a partial market orientation that encouraged audience-focused programming while still operating within state ownership and political oversight. This commercialization created new incentives that gradually transformed programming decisions. Stations increasingly considered audience preferences and advertising potential alongside political considerations, leading to more entertainment content and format innovations. The resulting system created a complex balance between market signals and political controls that distinguished Chinese television from both purely state-controlled media and the American commercial model. Lu Chengel, who would later found Phoenix Television, one of China's most successful, partially private networks, described this hybrid approach. We developed a television model that incorporates market mechanisms and entertainment value while maintaining clear boundaries around politically sensitive content. It is neither the American model nor the old propaganda model, but a distinctly Chinese approach to modern mass media. This evolution was not without tensions and setbacks. Throughout the 1990s, periods of relative openness alternated with campaigns to reassert ideological control, creating a cyclical pattern of liberalization and tightening that reflected ongoing internal debates about television's proper role in Chinese society. These fluctuations demonstrated the continued sensitivity surrounding mass media even as the system evolved toward greater commercialization and entertainment orientation. Zhang Yimou, who transitioned from television to become one of China's most celebrated film directors, later characterized this period. There was constant negotiation between creative impulses and political boundaries, between audience demands and official priorities. The space for creative expression expanded overall, but never in a simple linear progression. It was always a complex dance between different imperatives. By the late 1990s, China's television transformation had advanced significantly, creating a system that bore little resemblance to the single-channel limited hours broadcasting that had existed when Chinese officials first encountered American cable television 2 decades earlier. The country now supported hundreds of television stations broadcasting multiple channels, with programming that ranged from news and educational content to entertainment, sports, and specialized interest programming. Yet, fundamental differences from the American model remained. While American cable television had evolved through private enterprise within a regulatory framework emphasizing competition and limited content restrictions, Chinese television had developed through controlled expansion of a state-owned system that selectively incorporated commercial elements while maintaining clear political boundaries. This distinct development path reflected the strategic response that Chinese authorities had formulated after their initial exposure to American television. Rather than either rejecting international influences or wholly embracing them, China had crafted an approach that selectively adapted aspects of global television trends while maintaining core control mechanisms and cultural specificity. Ding Guangzhen, who headed China's Central Propaganda Department in the late 1990s, articulated this philosophy in a speech to television executives. We must create television that is both modern and Chinese, that meets audience desires for entertainment and information while upholding our social values and stability. The goal is not to create hundreds of channels for the sake of quantity, but to ensure that our growing television system serves national development and cultural confidence. This selective adaptation was particularly evident in the handling of foreign content on Chinese screens. Rather than either excluding international programming or accepting it wholesale, Chinese authorities developed a graduated system that allowed certain types of foreign content, particularly entertainment without obvious political implications, while restricting news and commentary from foreign sources. By the late 1990s, Chinese viewers could regularly watch imported sports, music videos, nature documentaries, and selected dramas on domestic channels, providing a window to international content without granting direct access to foreign broadcasters' news or commentary. This approach reflected a sophisticated understanding of television's multiple functions, allowing greater openness in entertainment spheres while maintaining tighter control over politically sensitive information. The late 1990s also saw China begin to position itself not just as a receiver of international television influences, but increasingly as a creator and exporter of content. Chinese historical dramas found audiences across Asia, while CCTV launched international services broadcasting Chinese perspectives to global audiences. This outward expansion represented a new phase in China's television development, moving from learning from international broadcasters to competing with them in regional and global markets. This evolution from student to competitor reflected growing confidence in China's distinctive media approach. After 2 decades of observing, selectively adapting, and steadily developing its television capabilities, China had created a system that could produce programming with technical quality and entertainment value competitive with international standards while operating within its unique political framework. The digital revolution of the late 1990s and early 2000s brought new dimensions to this evolving relationship between Chinese and American television models. Cable digitization, direct-to-home satellite services, and emerging internet video platforms created new distribution channels and content possibilities in both countries, once again raising questions about how China would respond to these technological developments. The American cable landscape continued its expansion into hundreds of increasingly specialized channels, while emerging streaming platforms began pointing toward a future of on-demand viewing. Chinese officials visiting the United States in the late 1990s and early 2000s encountered not just the cable abundance that had shocked their predecessors, but now also early digital platforms that suggested even greater fragmentation and viewer control. Wu Jichuan, who served as China's Minister of Information Industry during this period, described his impression after a 2001 visit to American media companies. 20 years ago, our officials were shocked by 50 channels. Today, we see not just hundreds of channels, but the beginning of systems where viewers select exactly what they want to watch at any moment. The implications for media management are profound. China's response to these developments continued its pattern of selective adaptation, embracing digital broadcasting technology while implementing regulatory frameworks to maintain oversight in the new environment. The country launched its own digital television standards, expanded broadband infrastructure to support new media forms, and began developing regulatory approaches for emerging internet video platforms. By the early 2000s, the cultural shock that Chinese officials had experienced upon first encountering American cable television had evolved into a sophisticated, strategic engagement with global media developments. The question was no longer whether China would respond to international media influences, but how it would shape these influences to create a system aligned with its national priorities and cultural values. This evolution was evident in the contrast between delegation reports from different eras. Where visitors in the late 1970s had expressed simple amazement at channel quantity and content variety, delegations in the early 2000s produced nuanced analyses of digital broadcasting standards, audience measurement systems, and content regulation in multi-platform environments, reflecting China's transition from outside observer to active participant in global television development. Chen Xiaoming, who participated in media delegations to the United States in both 1983 and 2003, reflected on this evolution. In 1983, we were students observing an alien system. By 2003, we were colleagues exchanging expertise on common challenges, though still with different approaches based on our distinct social systems. The relationship had fundamentally changed as China developed its own sophisticated media ecosystem. This transformation was particularly evident in discussions of television technology. By the early 2000s, China had become not just an importer of broadcasting equipment, but a significant developer and exporter of television technology. Chinese engineers contributed to international digital broadcasting standards, while Chinese manufacturers became major suppliers of television sets and broadcasting equipment to global markets. This technological advancement represented a remarkable journey from the wide capability gap that had existed when Chinese officials first visited American television facilities in the late 1970s. What had begun as a relationship of technological transfer had evolved into one of increasing parity and competition, though significant differences remained in content approaches and regulatory philosophies. The different paths taken by Chinese and American television development became increasingly evident in the early 21st century as both systems continued their evolution. American television moved toward greater fragmentation, with hundreds of cable channels complemented by emerging streaming platforms that further dispersed audiences across multiple content options and viewing modalities. Chinese television, while expanding in channel quantity and content diversity, maintained a more centralized approach, creating a system with significantly more viewing options than had existed in earlier decades, while preserving stronger central coordination than existed in the American model. This reflected a fundamental difference in media philosophy that had persisted despite technological convergence. Hu Zhengrong, a professor of media studies who has analyzed both systems, characterized this distinction. The American system evolved to provide maximum consumer choice within market constraints. The Chinese system evolved to provide sufficient viewer options and entertainment value while maintaining cultural coherence and political stability. Both systems reflect their respective social priorities. This observation highlights how the initial cultural shock of Chinese officials encountering American cable television had evolved into a more mature understanding of fundamental differences in media philosophy, differences that persisted even as the systems converged in certain technological and commercial aspects. By the mid-2000s, the questions facing both television systems increasingly centered on the emerging challenge of Internet video. As broadband penetration increased in both countries, online platforms began offering alternative distribution channels that bypassed traditional broadcasting infrastructure, raising new regulatory and business model questions. In the United States, this transition accelerated existing trends toward audience fragmentation and content specialization. In China, it presented both new challenges for content oversight and new opportunities for innovation within established boundaries. The response in both countries reflected their respective approaches to media development, market-driven evolution in the United States versus managed adaptation in China. This divergence, despite technological convergence, underscores how the different paths taken by Chinese and American television were not simply matters of technological capacity or commercial development, but reflected fundamental differences in media philosophy and societal priorities, differences that had been apparent from those first shocked encounters with channel abundance in American hotel rooms. As the digital era advanced, China's approach to television and video evolved to address new technologies while maintaining its distinct media philosophy. The launch of streaming platforms like Youku 2006, Tudu 2005, and later Iqiyi 2010 created new distribution channels for video content, while regulatory frameworks evolved to maintain oversight in the digital environment. These developments created a sophisticated ecosystem that combined elements observed in American media with distinctly Chinese characteristics, a system with substantial content diversity and commercial elements operating within established political boundaries. It represented the maturation of the approach that had begun developing after those first encounters with American cable television decades earlier. Wang Jianzhou, who had participated in early media delegations to the United States and later became a senior media executive, reflected in 2010, "What began with shock at seeing hundreds of American channels has evolved into a sophisticated understanding of different media models. We have created a system that provides entertainment diversity and commercial vitality while reflecting our social values and priorities, neither a copy of Western models nor a continuation of the past, but a distinctly Chinese approach to modern media." This evolution demonstrates how cultural shock can become a catalyst for strategic adaptation rather than simple emulation or rejection. The hundreds of American television channels that so astonished Chinese officials in the late 1970s did not lead to the wholesale adoption of the American media model, but rather stimulated a decades-long process of selective adaptation and indigenous innovation that produced a distinctive Chinese approach to television development. This process continues today as both countries navigate the evolving media landscape of streaming platforms, social media video, and emerging technologies. The relationship between Chinese and American media systems has evolved from initial one-way observation to a complex interaction where both systems influence global media development while maintaining their distinctive characteristics. The story of Chinese officials' shock upon encountering American cable television abundance represents more than a historical curiosity. It illuminates a pivotal moment in the evolution of global media systems and the complex cultural negotiations that shape technological adaptation. What began in the surprise of hotel rooms has evolved into one of the most significant, divergent media development paths in modern history. As China continues its media evolution in the streaming era, the legacy of those early encounters remains evident in its distinctive approach, one that combines technological sophistication and entertainment value with continued emphasis on cultural specificity and social stability. This approach neither wholly embraces nor rejects the American model that once shocked Chinese visitors, but rather represents a third path shaped by both international influence and domestic priorities. For contemporary observers of global media development, this history offers important insights into how technological exposure triggers complex processes of adaptation rather than simple emulation. The initial shock of hundreds of channels has evolved into a sophisticated engagement with global media trends, filtered through distinct national priorities and values. Liu Changle, founder of Phoenix Television, summarized this evolution. What we witnessed was not simply Chinese television becoming more like American television, but rather the development of a distinctly Chinese approach to modern media that incorporated certain international elements while maintaining its own character. The hundreds of American channels were not a destination to be reached, but a catalyst for developing our own path. This perspective highlights how cultural shock functions not as a simple stimulus for imitation, but as a complex trigger for reassessment and strategic adaptation. The encounter between Chinese officials and American cable television abundance ultimately contributed to the development of a distinctive Chinese media approach that continues to evolve today, an approach that incorporates commercial elements and entertainment value while maintaining different assumptions about media's relationship to state and society. For both Chinese and American media systems, the decades since those initial encounters have brought dramatic technological and market changes that have transformed the television landscape. Streaming platforms, mobile viewing, social media integration, and interactive capabilities have created media environments that differ significantly from the cable television systems that first shocked Chinese visitors. Yet, the philosophical differences that became apparent during those early encounters remain evident in contemporary approaches. American media development continues to emphasize market determination and limited content regulation, while Chinese media evolution maintains stronger central coordination and content boundaries, despite substantial commercialization and diversity expansion. This persistent divergence, despite technological convergence, demonstrates how media systems reflect deeper social priorities, rather than simply following universal technological trajectories. The different paths taken by Chinese and American television after those initial encounters reveal how similar technologies can develop in distinctly different ways based on varying social, political, and cultural contexts. For Chinese officials who first encountered American cable television in the late 1970s, the hundreds of available channels represented not just technological abundance, but a fundamentally different conception of media's role in society. Their response, initial shock followed by strategic adaptation, launched a 4-decade process of media development that has produced a sophisticated system with distinctly Chinese characteristics. This evolution demonstrates how cultural exchange functions not as simple transfer, but as complex negotiation, with technologies and practices reinterpreted and adapted as they move between different social contexts. The American cable television that so impressed Chinese visitors was not simply adopted, but rather became a reference point for developing a different approach tailored to Chinese conditions and priorities. As both China and the United States continue navigating the evolving media landscape of the 21st century, the legacy of those early encounters remains evident in their distinctive approaches. What began with surprise in hotel rooms has evolved into one of the most significant comparative cases in global media development, a case that illustrates how similar technologies can follow different developmental paths based on varying social priorities and values. For contemporary observers of global media trends, this historical case offers valuable insights into the complex relationship between technology transfer, cultural values, and media development in a globalizing world. It demonstrates how initial exposure to different media models initiates not simple imitation, but complex processes of adaptation, selection, and indigenous innovation that reflect deeper social priorities and values. As we move deeper into the digital age, with streaming platforms and social media further transforming media consumption in both countries, the legacy of those early encounters continues to shape different approaches to similar challenges. The shock of hundreds of channels has given way to the complexity of countless content options available on demand across multiple platforms, creating new questions about content regulation, cultural influence, and media's social role. In both countries, television has evolved from a centralized broadcasting medium to one component in a complex digital media ecosystem that includes streaming platforms, social media video, and mobile content consumption. Yet the different approaches established in response to earlier technological developments continue to influence how each society navigates these new challenges. Chen Wei, who served in China's National Radio and Television Administration and participated in media delegations to the United States in both the 1980s and 2010s, observed, "The technological gap that once existed between our television systems has largely closed. Today's differences are primarily matters of regulatory philosophy and social priority rather than technical capability. Both systems can deliver sophisticated content across multiple platforms. The differences lie in how that capacity is directed and governed." This observation highlights how the relationship between Chinese and American media systems has evolved from one of stark technological disparity to one of different approaches to similar capabilities, an evolution that began with those first shocked encounters with channel abundance in American hotel rooms. For American visitors to China today, the country's sophisticated media ecosystem, with its multiple channels, streaming platforms, and advanced production capabilities, bears little resemblance to the limited television system that existed when Chinese officials first encountered American cable abundance. This transformation represents one of the most dramatic media developments of the past 4 decades, a development catalyzed in part by that initial cross-cultural exposure. Yet for Chinese visitors to the United States, American media still represents a distinctly different approach despite technological convergence. The philosophical differences that became apparent during those early encounters, different conceptions of media's relationship to state and market, different balances between diversity and cohesion, different approaches to content oversight, remain evident in contemporary systems despite the diminishing of purely technical disparities. This persistent divergence within technological convergence illustrates how media systems reflect deeper social values rather than simply following universal development trajectories. The different paths taken by Chinese and American television after those initial encounters reveal how similar technologies can develop in distinctly different ways based on varying social, political, and cultural contexts. For scholars of comparative media systems, this history offers important insights into how technological transfer operates across different social systems. Rather than producing simple convergence toward a universal model, technological exposure initiates complex processes of adaptation and reinterpretation that produce distinctive hybrid forms reflecting local priorities and values. As Wang Jianzhou reflected in his 2015 memoir of China's media transformation, what began with our amazement at American television abundance has produced not an American-style system in China, but rather a distinctly Chinese approach to modern media that incorporates certain international elements while maintaining its own character. This represents not failed emulation, but successful adaptation, creating a system that serves our particular social needs while achieving technical sophistication and audience engagement. This perspective highlights how cultural encounters function not as simple transfers but as complex negotiations, with technologies and practices reinterpreted as they move between different social contexts. The American cable television that so impressed Chinese visitors was not simply adopted, but rather became a reference point for developing a different approach tailored to Chinese conditions and priorities. As both China and the United States continue navigating the evolving media landscape of the 21st century, with streaming services, social media video, and emerging technologies further transforming content creation and distribution, the legacy of those early encounters remains evident in their distinctive approaches. What began with surprise in hotel rooms has evolved into one of the most significant comparative cases in global media development, a case that illustrates how similar technologies can follow different developmental paths based on varying social priorities and values. The continued evolution of both systems in the streaming era further demonstrates this pattern. As American media has moved toward even greater fragmentation across multiple streaming platforms, Chinese digital video has developed a more coordinated ecosystem that provides substantial content diversity within established boundaries. Both approaches reflect the distinct media philosophies that became apparent during those first encounters with cable abundance decades earlier. For contemporary media professionals in both countries, understanding this historical evolution provides important context for current developments. The relationship between Chinese and American media systems has evolved from initial one-way observation to a complex interaction where both systems influence global media development while maintaining their distinctive characteristics. This evolution also illustrates broader patterns in how societies respond to technological exposure. Rather than producing simple convergence toward a universal model, cross-cultural technological encounters typically generate complex processes of selective adaptation that reflect local conditions and priorities. The story of Chinese officials encountering American cable television abundance represents a particularly significant case of this broader pattern, one that has shaped media development across the world's two largest economies for over 4 decades. As we look toward future media developments, including artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and other emerging technologies, this history suggests that we should expect continued divergence in how different societies incorporate these technologies into their media systems. Rather than assuming technological determinism will produce universal patterns, the legacy of these earlier encounters suggests that new technologies will likely be adapted to reflect existing social priorities and values. For Chinese officials who first encountered American cable television in the late 1970s, the hundreds of available channels represented not just technological abundance, but a fundamentally different conception of media's role in society. Their response, initial shock followed by strategic adaptation, launched a 4-decade process of media development that has produced a sophisticated system with distinctly Chinese characteristics. This process continues today as both countries navigate new media technologies and distribution systems. While the specific technologies have changed dramatically since those first encounters, the underlying questions about media's relationship to state and society, about balancing diversity and cohesion, and about navigating global influence while maintaining cultural identity remain central to how both systems evolve. In this sense, the story of Chinese officials' shock upon encountering American cable television abundance represents more than a historical curiosity. It illuminates a pivotal moment in the evolution of global media systems and the complex cultural negotiations that shape technological adaptation. What began in the surprise of hotel rooms has evolved into one of the most significant divergent media development paths in modern history. As Liu Chengle reflected in a 2018 interview about global media development, every society must determine what kind of media system best serves its needs and values. What we learned from observing American television was not that we should create an identical system, but rather that we needed to develop our own approach to modern media that would serve Chinese society's particular requirements. The result has been neither simple imitation nor rejection, but rather creative adaptation, developing a system that achieves technical sophistication and audience engagement while reflecting our distinct social priorities. This perspective captures the complex legacy of those early encounters, a legacy visible not in simple convergence, but in sophisticated parallel evolution, with both systems developing advanced capabilities while maintaining their distinctive characteristics. It demonstrates how cultural shock functions not as a simple stimulus for imitation, but as a complex trigger for reassessment and strategic adaptation. For citizens of both countries, this parallel evolution has created media environments that reflect their respective social systems while incorporating global technological developments. American viewers enjoy unprecedented content choice across multiple platforms within a system emphasizing market determination and limited content regulation. Chinese audiences access increasingly diverse entertainment options within a system that maintains stronger central coordination and content boundaries. These different approaches to similar technologies illustrate how media systems reflect deeper social values rather than simply following universal development trajectories. The different paths taken by Chinese and American television after those initial encounters reveal how technologies are adapted to serve particular social priorities rather than determining those priorities themselves. As we reflect on this history from our contemporary perspective, with streaming platforms and social media having further transformed media consumption in both countries, the legacy of those early encounters continues to shape different approaches to similar challenges. The shock of hundreds of channels has given way to the complexity of countless content options available on demand across multiple platforms, creating new questions about content regulation, cultural influence, and media's social role. Yet the distinctive approaches established in response to earlier technological developments continue to influence how each society navigates these new challenges. The philosophical differences that became apparent during those early encounters, different conceptions of media's relationship to state and market, different balances between diversity and cohesion, different approaches to content oversight, remain evident in contemporary systems despite the diminishing of purely technical disparities. This persistent divergence within technological convergence offers perhaps the most significant insight from this historical case, that technologies do not determine social arrangements, but rather are adapted to reflect existing social priorities and values. The different paths taken by Chinese and American television after those first shocked encounters in hotel rooms illustrate how similar technologies can develop in distinctly different ways based on varying social, political, and cultural contexts. For contemporary observers of global media development, this history offers a valuable perspective on current debates about technology transfer and cultural influence. It suggests that technological exposure typically generates not simple convergence, but complex processes of selective adaptation that reflect local conditions and priorities. The story of Chinese officials encountering American cable television abundance represents a particularly significant case of this broader pattern, one that continues to shape media development across the world's two largest economies.